Chapter 6. Marius. On the night after the Battle of Waterloo, in June 1815, a robber moved quietly around the battlefield, stealing money and jewellery from the bodies of dead soldiers. He saw a hand sticking out from a pile of dead men and horses, a gold ring on its middle finger shining in the moonlight. The robber took the ring, but as he turned to leave, the hand grabbed his jacket. The robber pulled the body from the pile of bodies and saw that he had rescued a French officer. The man had a terrible wound in his head, but he was still alive.
"Thank you,"
the officer whispered.
"You've saved my life. What's your name?"
"Thénardier," the robber replied.
"I shall not forget that name,"
the officer replied.
"And you must remember mine. My name's Pontmercy."
Without another word, the robber took the wounded man's watch and purse and disappeared into the night. Georges Pontmercy was married with a young son. He survived the Battle of Waterloo, but unfortunately in the same year his wife died. His father-in-law, Monsieur Gillenormand, was a very wealthy man, but the two men hated each other. Monsieur Gillenormand hated everybody who liked Napoleon. He thought that Pontmercy was no better than a beggar, a penniless adventurer who only wanted his money. Pontmercy thought that Monsieur Gillenormand was an old fool. When his daughter died, Monsieur Gillenormand made Pontmercy an offer which he could not refuse. "You have no money, and I am rich," he said. "If you want to keep your son, Marius, I'll give you no money. But if you give the boy to me, and promise never to see him again, I'll look after him." Pontmercy, wanting his son to have a good life, had sadly given him to Monsieur Gillenormand, and never saw his son or father-in-law again. Marius grew up with his grandfather, and never knew his father. Monsieur Gillenormand always told him that his father had been no good, that he was a poor soldier and a drunk who had abandoned him after his mother's death. For many years Marius believed this, but when he was 17 years old, he learnt the truth. His father, a brave officer who had fought for Napoleon and nearly died at the Battle of Waterloo, had really loved him and his mother very much. Without telling his grandfather, Marius tried to contact his father, and finally discovered where he was living. He went at once to visit him, but he was too late. His father had just died. A poor man, Georges Pontmercy had left his son nothing, apart from a letter. "For my son. My life was saved at Waterloo by a sergeant. His name was Thénardier. I believe that he recently managed a small inn in the village of Montfermeil, not far from Paris. If you ever find this man, I want you to help him in any way you can." Marius returned to Paris, but continued to visit his father's grave regularly, without telling his grandfather. One day, however, his grandfather discovered what he was doing. They had a big quarrel, and Monsieur Gillenormand ordered Marius to leave his house. For the next 3 years, Marius lived in a small room in an old damp-walled building on the outskirts of Paris. The same room that Valjean and Cosette had lived in 8 years earlier. He gave up studying law and earned his living by working in a bookshop and helping to write dictionaries. He did not earn very much money, but it was enough for the rent and simple meals. He rarely bought new clothes, but he was proud of the fact that he had never been in debt. His grandfather often tried to send him money, but Marius always returned it. He hated his grandfather for the unjust, cruel way he had treated his poor father. Life was hard for him, but he never forgot the promise he had made his father, that he would find Thénardier, the man who had saved his father's life, and help him in any way he could. Marius was a handsome young man, but he was also extremely shy. When girls looked at him and smiled, he thought they were laughing at his old clothes. In fact, they were attracted by his good looks, but he was not confident enough to realize this. As a result, he had no girlfriend, but he was happy with his books. "You shouldn't stay alone all the time," his good friend Enjolras said to him. "You should get out more. Give the girls a chance. They'd be good for you, Marius. Otherwise you'll turn into a priest." Marius paid little attention to his friend and continued his quiet life of work, study, and daily walks. While walking around his part of the city, Marius had noticed an elderly man and a young girl in the Luxembourg Gardens. They always sat next to each other on the same bench. The man, who was perhaps 60, had white hair and a serious but friendly-looking face. The girl, who was aged 13 or 14, always wore the same badly cut black dress. She was very thin, almost ugly, but Marius noticed that she had lovely blue eyes. They seemed to be father and daughter. Marius saw this couple frequently on his regular walks in the gardens, but although he was very interested in them, they seemed not to notice him at all. The girl was always talking happily, while the man said very little. He just looked at the girl from time to time with an affectionate, fatherly smile. Enjolras had often seen the couple too. "Do you know who they are?" Marius asked him one day. "I call the man Monsieur Leblanc, because of his white hair, and the girl Mademoiselle Lanois, because of her black dress," his friend replied. For almost a year, Marius saw the old man and the young girl daily in the same place at the same time. Then, for some reason, Marius stopped going to the Luxembourg Gardens. When he returned, one summer morning 6 months later, he saw the same couple sitting on the same bench. But something amazing had happened. The man was the same, but the thin, plain girl of 6 months earlier had become a beautiful young woman. Her rough black dress had been replaced by one of fine black silk. She had soft brown hair, pale, smooth skin, deep blue eyes, and a lovely smile that lit up her face like sunshine. She looked up when Marius passed for the second time, and gave him a casual glance. Marius, however, walked on, thinking of other things. For the next few days he passed the bench in the gardens without looking at her. Then one day, as he was passing, thinking about nothing in particular, the girl looked up at him, and their eyes met. A second later she looked away, and Marius walked on, but, in a strange way, he knew his life had changed. What he had experienced in that moment was not the honest, innocent gaze of a child. It was something more than that. Whatever it was, Marius sensed that after that moment, his life would never be the same. The next day Marius returned to the Luxembourg Gardens wearing his best clothes. He walked around slowly, stopping to look at the ducks on the lake, then casually approached the bench where Mademoiselle Lanois and her father were sitting. As he walked past, he kept his eyes fixed on the girl. But she did not seem to notice him. She was talking quietly to her father, and Marius could hear the soft, exciting murmur of her voice. Without intending to, he stopped, turned round, and walked past the bench again. He felt his face go red and his heart beat loudly in his chest. He was sure this time that she had watched him as he passed. He did not go back a third time, but sat down on a bench at the opposite end of the gardens. He looked at the girl out of the corner of his eye. She seemed to fill the far end of the gardens with a kind of blue mist. Taking a deep breath, he rose and was going to pass the bench for a third time when he stopped. He suddenly realized that, in his feverish state, he had forgotten about the old man. What would he be thinking when he saw a strange young man walking backwards and forwards in front of his bench? Without another thought, Marius left the gardens and went home. He returned the next morning, and sat on a bench all day, pretending to read a book, not daring to go near the bench where the girl and her father were sitting. He did the same every day for 2 weeks. Towards the end of the second week, while Marius was sitting in his usual place, he looked up from his book, and his face went pale. Something had happened at the far end of the gardens. Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter had risen from their bench and were slowly walking in his direction. Marius shut his book, opened it again, and made an effort to read. When he felt that they were near him, he looked up, and saw that the girl was looking steadily at him with a soft, thoughtful gaze that made him tremble from head to foot. He gazed after her until she had disappeared from sight, then rose to his feet and walked around laughing and talking to himself. Finally he left the gardens in the mad hope of seeing her in the street, but instead he met Enjolras, who invited him to a meal. Every day for the next month, Marius went to the Luxembourg Gardens, excited by knowing that the girl was secretly looking at him, but too shy and embarrassed to know what to do. He avoided walking directly in front of the bench, partly from shyness, partly because he did not want to attract her father's attention. Sometimes he stood for half an hour in a place where her father could not see him, looking at her and enjoying the small, secret smiles she sent him. But it seemed that Monsieur Leblanc had begun to suspect what was happening, because often, when Marius appeared, he got to his feet and walked away, taking his daughter with him. Sometimes Monsieur Leblanc took his daughter to a different bench, to see if Marius would follow them. Marius failed to understand the trick, and made the mistake of doing so. Then Monsieur Leblanc became irregular in his visits, and did not always bring his daughter with him. When this happened, Marius did not stay in the gardens, which was another mistake. Marius was too much in love to think clearly. His desire for the girl was growing daily, and he dreamt of her every night. One evening, he found a handkerchief lying on the bench which Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter had just left. It was a plain white handkerchief with the initials U.F. in one corner. Ursula. Marius said the first name that came into his head. A delicious name. He kissed the handkerchief, breathed in its perfume, wore it next to his heart by day, and kept it under his pillow at night. I can feel her whole soul in it, he told himself. In fact, the handkerchief belonged to Monsieur Leblanc, and had simply fallen out of his pocket. But Marius was unaware of this. He never appeared in the Luxembourg Gardens without the handkerchief pressed to his lips or his heart. The girl could not understand his behaviour at all, and looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Such modesty," Marius sighed. Eventually, Marius was not satisfied with just knowing the girl's name. He wanted to know where she lived. He found that she lived in a small house at the quiet end of the Rue de l'Ouest. As well as the joy of seeing her in the gardens, he now had the pleasure of following her home. One evening, having followed them to the house and watched them enter, he went in after them and spoke to the concierge. The concierge, however, became suspicious, thinking that Marius was connected with the police, and refused to say anything. The following day, Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter did not come to the gardens at all. They did not come for a whole week, and Marius began to feel depressed. Every night he stood outside their house and gazed up at their lighted windows. Sometimes he saw a shadow pass in front of a lamp, and his heart beat faster. On the 8th night, there was no light in the windows. Marius waited, his heart aching with pain, until finally going home. The next day they did not go to the gardens, so again Marius went to the house as night was falling. Once again there were no lights in the windows. He knocked on the door and spoke to the concierge. "Where's the old gentleman?" he asked.
"He's left."
Marius felt the blood leave his face. Almost fainting, he asked in a weak voice, "When did he leave?"
"Yesterday."
"Where has he gone?"
"I've no idea."
"Did he leave an address?" The concierge then recognized Marius from the previous week. He stared fiercely at him and said,
"So, it's you again. I was right. You are some kind of policeman."
With those words, he slammed the door in Marius's face. Chapter 7. The Jondrettes. Summer and autumn passed, and winter came. But Marius saw no sign of Monsieur Leblanc or Ursula. He searched everywhere for them, but without success. He became like a homeless dog, wandering the streets in a mood of dark despair. Without Ursula, his life had become meaningless. Work disgusted him. Walking tired him. Solitude bored him. "If only I hadn't followed them home," he told himself. "It gave me so much happiness just to look at her, and now through my stupidity I've lost even that." Enjolras and his other friends tried to cheer him up by taking him to exciting places, but these expeditions always ended in the same way. Marius would leave the group and walk around the streets of Paris unhappily on his own. One cold but sunny afternoon in February, Marius was walking along the street when two young girls, dressed in rags, ran into him. One was tall and thin, the other smaller. From what they were shouting at each other, he understood that they were running from the police. He stood for a moment staring after them as they disappeared round a corner. Then he noticed a small parcel of papers lying on the ground. Realizing that one of the girls must have dropped it, he picked it up and called after them. But it was too late. The girls had already disappeared from sight. With a sigh, he put the package in his pocket and went on to dinner. That night, at home, Marius opened the package and found that it contained 4 letters, all addressed to different people, and smelling strongly of cheap tobacco. Marius read the 4 letters, and discovered that they were all asking for money. However, there was something strange about them. Although they all seemed to be written by different people, they were written on the same rough paper, in the same handwriting. He also noticed that each of them had similar spelling mistakes. Thinking no more about it, he wrapped the letters up again, threw them into a corner, and went to bed. The next morning, while he was working, there was a gentle knock on his door. "Come in," Marius said, expecting it to be the concierge, Madame Bougon. But the voice that answered, saying, "I beg your pardon, monsieur," was not that of Madame Bougon. It was more like the voice of a sick old man. Marius looked up quickly, and saw that his visitor was a thin girl, wearing just a skirt and shirt. She looked cold and ill, and when she spoke, Marius saw that she had lost several of her teeth. There was, however, still a trace of beauty in the 16-year-old face, like pale sunlight beneath the thick clouds of a winter's dawn. Marius rose to his feet, sure that he had seen the girl somewhere before. "What can I do for you, mademoiselle?" he asked.
"I've got a letter for you, Monsieur Marius."
Marius opened the letter and read, "My warm-hearted neighbour, I have heard of how you kindly paid my rent for me 6 months ago. I thank you for it. But my eldest daughter will tell you that my wife is sick, and none of us have had any food for 4 days. Please, monsieur, show us the kindness of your generous heart again. My daughter is at your service. Yours truly, Jondrette." Marius realized at once that the handwriting, the yellow paper, and the smell of cheap tobacco was the same as in the 4 letters he had read the previous evening. He now had 5 letters, all the work of one author, the man who lived with his family in the next room. The Jondrette family had been Marius's neighbours for many months, but he had never before paid much attention to them. This was why he had failed to recognize the 2 daughters when they had run into him on the street. But now he understood that Jondrette's business was writing dishonest letters, asking for money from people he imagined were wealthier than himself. Marius looked up from the letter and watched the girl moving fearlessly around his room, studying the furniture and the mirror on the wall. Her eyes lit up when she noticed the books on his writing desk. "Books," she said, and then added with pride, "I know how to read." Picking up a pen that lay on the table, she wrote on a piece of paper, "Be careful. The police are coming." She showed Marius her work, and then, changing the subject quickly for no reason at all, she gazed into his eyes and said shyly, "Do you know, Monsieur Marius, that you're a very handsome boy?" Approaching him, she rested a cold red hand on his shoulder and said, "You never notice me, Monsieur Marius, but I know you. I see you on the stairs, and I see you walking around the streets looking so sad and alone." Marius's cheeks went red. He moved away from the girl's touch and said, "I think, mademoiselle, that I have something belonging to you." He handed her the parcel of letters. She clapped her hands and cried, "We've been looking for that everywhere. How did you know they were mine? Of course, the handwriting. You were the man we ran into last night." While she talked excitedly, she took out one of the letters.
Ah, this is for the old man who goes to church every day. If I hurry, I might be able to catch him. Perhaps he'll give me enough for a dinner. We haven't eaten for 3 days.
Marius took a 5-franc piece from his pocket and handed it to the girl.
The sun's come out at last, she cried, eagerly accepting the coin. That's enough food for 2 days. You're a real gentleman, monsieur.
With those words, she gave a little laugh and wave, grabbed some dry bread from the table, and disappeared out of the door. Marius had lived for 5 years without much money, but he had never been really poor. Now, after his conversation with the girl from the next room, he understood what real poverty was. Only a thin wall separated him from the family of lost souls in the room next door. He had heard them and seen them, but had paid them no attention, and he suddenly felt guilty. If they had had another neighbour, he thought, one who had noticed their suffering, perhaps they could have been rescued by now. As Marius was thinking about the sad life of the family in the next room, he stared dreamily at the wall that separated them. Then, in the top corner near the ceiling, Marius saw that there was a triangular hole. "Let's see what these people are really like," Marius thought. "Then I'll be in a better position to help them." He stood on a cupboard, put his eye to the hole, and looked through it into his neighbour's room. The Jondrettes' room was dirty and evil-smelling, unlike Marius's bare but clean room. Its only furniture was a chair, an old table, some cracked dishes, and 2 dirty beds, one on each side of a fireplace. A man with a long grey beard was sitting at the table, writing a letter and smoking a pipe. A large woman with greying hair, once red, was sitting by the fire, while a thin, pale-faced child sat on one of the beds. Marius, depressed at what he saw, was going to get down from the cupboard when the door of the Jondrettes' room opened, and the elder girl came in. Slamming the door shut behind her, she cried victoriously, "He's coming!" "Who's coming?" Her father looked up. "The old man who goes to church. He's following me. I saw him with his daughter in the church and gave him the letter. He said he would follow me here. I ran ahead to tell you he'll be here in 2 minutes. "You're a good girl," the man said, rising quickly to his feet. Then turning to his wife, he said, "Quickly, put out the fire." While she poured water on the flames, the man broke the chair with his foot and told his younger daughter to break a window. She put her fist through the glass and ran to her bed, crying because her arm was covered in blood. "Excellent!" Her father smiled, tearing a piece off his shirt and using it as a bandage. "Now we're ready for the kind gentleman. When he sees how miserable we are, he'll give us a lot of money, you'll see." Moments later, there was a gentle knock on the door. Jondrette rushed to open it, bowing almost to the ground as he did so. "Please, come in, my dear sir, please, enter with your charming young lady." An elderly man and a young girl appeared in the doorway, and Marius, still looking through the hole in the wall, could not believe his eyes. It was she. She. Everyone who has ever loved will feel the force of that small word. In the bright mist that clouded his vision, Marius could hardly see the features of the sweet face that had lit his life for 6 months and had then disappeared, filling his life with darkness. And now the vision had reappeared. When Marius had recovered some of his senses, he saw that she seemed a little paler than before. Her companion, as usual, was Monsieur Leblanc. As she entered the room, she put a large parcel on the table. "Monsieur, you will find some woolen stockings and blankets in the parcel," Monsieur Leblanc told Jondrette. "You are extremely generous, monsieur," Jondrette said again, bowing to the ground. "But, as you can see, we are unfortunate in many ways. We are without food, monsieur, and without heating. No warmth for my unhappy children. Our only chair is broken, a broken window in this weather. My wife ill in bed, and our younger daughter injured." "Oh, the poor child," Ursula said, seeing the girl's bleeding wrist. "She had an accident in the machine shop where she works for 6 sous an hour," Jondrette explained. "They may have to cut off her arm." The daughter, taking her father's words seriously, began to scream with fear. While Monsieur Leblanc and Ursula tried to comfort her, Jondrette approached his wife and said in a whisper, "Take a good look at that man." He then returned to Monsieur Leblanc and told him about his debts. "I owe 60 francs in rent," he said. Monsieur Leblanc took a coin out of his pocket and put it on the table. 5 francs is all I have with me," he said. "But I'll take my daughter home and come back this evening with more money for you." Jondrette accompanied Monsieur Leblanc and Ursula out of the door, and after a few minutes' indecision, Marius jumped down from the cupboard and ran out into the street. But he was too late. Their carriage had already gone. Miserably, he turned back to the house. He went into his room, pushing the door behind him. But the door would not shut. Turning, Marius saw that a hand was holding it open. "What is it?" he demanded. It was the Jondrette girl. "So it's you again," he said almost fiercely. "What do you want now?" She did not reply, but stood thoughtfully looking at him, seeming to have lost all her earlier confidence. She had not entered the room, but was still standing in the half-light of the corridor. "What do you want?" Marius repeated angrily. "Monsieur Marius," she said at last, a faint light in her sad eyes. "You seem upset. What's the matter?" "Nothing. Now, please leave me alone." Marius tried again to shut the door, but she still held it open. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You aren't rich, but you were generous this morning. You've been kind to us. Now I want to be kind to you. Is there anything that I can do?" Marius considered her offer, then had an idea. Moving closer to her, he said, "Do you know the address of those people who've just left your room?" "No." "Can you find out for me?" "Is that what you want?" she said, a disappointed look on her face. "Yes." The girl looked hard at him for a minute. "What will you give me?" she said at last. "Anything you want." "Anything?" "Yes." "Then I'll get it." She left immediately, closing the door behind her. Marius sat down and buried his face in his hands, too overcome by emotion to think clearly. But then he heard a loud voice from the next room. "I tell you I'm sure." Jondrette was speaking to his wife. "I recognized him." Without another thought, Marius jumped onto the cupboard and looked again through the hole in the wall. "Really?" His wife looked puzzled. "Are you sure?"
"Of course I'm sure. It's been 8 years, but I recognised him at once."
He told the two girls to leave the room, and then, when alone with his wife, he said,
"And I recognise the girl too. I'm surprised you didn't."
"Why should I? I've never seen her." But Jondrette bent down and whispered something in her ear. Straightening up, he said,
"Now do you recognise her?"
"Her?" said the woman, her voice filled with sudden hatred.
"Are you sure? That's impossible," she cried. "Our daughter's barefoot and without a dress between them, while she wears leather boots and a fur coat. You must be wrong. You've forgotten that child was ugly, and this one's not bad-looking. I tell you it's the same girl. You'll see. And I'll tell you another thing. She's going to make us a fortune. I'm tired of being poor. We deserve a better life, and this is our chance."
"What do you mean?"
"He said he'll be here at 6 o'clock with 60 francs. I'll bring some friends round, and we'll make sure he gives us a lot more money."
"What will you do if he doesn't give you more money?" Jondrette stroked his beard and laughed.
"We'll know what to do about it."
And then, as he was going to leave the room, he turned to his wife and said,
"You know, it's lucky he didn't recognise me. If he had, he wouldn't be coming back here again. It's the beard that saved me. My lovely, long, romantic beard."
With an ugly laugh, he pulled his cap down over his eyes and left the room. Although Marius was a dreamer and not a man of action, he knew immediately that he had to save Monsieur Leblanc and Ursula from the trap that Jondrette was setting for them. But what could he do? He could not warn Monsieur Leblanc because he did not know the old man's address. There was only one thing to do. He had to tell the police. Half an hour later, Marius was at the nearest police station. The desk clerk showed him into the police chief's office, where a tall man with a wide face and a thin, tight mouth was trying to keep warm next to a fire. "Are you the chief of police?" Marius asked.
"He's away," the tall man said. "I'm Inspector Javert. Now what do you want?"
Marius told Javert about the morning's events. When he told Javert his address, he noticed the inspector's eyes light up with great interest. Then, when everything had been explained, Javert thought for a moment. Finally, he asked Marius for his door key, and told him to go home and hide quietly in his room, so that his neighbours would think he was out.
"Take these with you,"
the inspector went on, producing 2 small guns.
"When the old man and the girl arrive, let them start their business. When you think it's getting dangerous, shoot one of these guns. After that, I'll take charge."
Back in his room, Marius sat down nervously on his bed. It was nearly 6 o'clock. Outside, it had stopped snowing, and a full moon was growing steadily brighter above the mist. Suddenly he heard voices. Taking off his boots, he quietly climbed onto the cupboard and looked through the hole in the wall. A fire burned in the corner of the room, filling it with blood-red light. Jondrette, who had just come in, was shaking snow from his shoes.
"Everything's arranged," he said. "Has the concierge gone out?" "Yes," his wife said. "And you're sure he's not in next door?" "Positive." "Good." Then he turned to his daughters. "Now, you two must go and keep guard in the street. One by the gate, one at the street corner." "A fine job," the elder girl called back. keeping guard barefoot in the snow."
"Tomorrow you'll have fur boots," her father called out after her. A few minutes later, there was nobody in the building except for Marius and the Jondrettes. Marius watched as Jondrette put a metal bar in the fire and inspected a rope ladder on the table. Next, he opened a drawer, took out a long knife, and tested its blade with his finger. Suddenly, at exactly 6 o'clock, the door into the Jondrettes' room opened.
"Welcome, monsieur,"
Jondrette said, rising to his feet. Monsieur Leblanc appeared, and put 4 coins on the table.
"That is for your rent and food, monsieur," he said. "Now, we must discuss what else is needed."
Jondrette quietly told his wife to dismiss the carriage, and when she had left the room, turned back to his visitor.
"How is the wounded child?"
Monsieur Leblanc asked him.
"Not well." Jondrette smiled sadly. "She's in great pain. Her sister has taken her to hospital, but they'll be back soon."
The conversation continued politely in this way for several minutes. Monsieur Leblanc asked Jondrette about his circumstances, and Jondrette smiled sadly as he invented lie after lie. Finally, Jondrette picked up a large picture that was leaning against the wall and showed it to Monsieur Leblanc.
"What's that?"
Monsieur Leblanc said, looking at the badly drawn picture of a soldier in uniform.
"It's a work of art,"
Jondrette informed him.
"I love this picture as much as I love my 2 daughters, but unfortunately I have to sell it. What do you think it's worth?"
"It's just an old inn sign. It's worth about 3 francs.
"I'll accept 1,000,
Jondrette softly replied. Monsieur Leblanc rose, and standing with his back to the wall, looked quickly round the room. Jondrette was on his left. His wife was standing on his right near the door. Jondrette put the picture down and stepped quietly towards the old man.
"You don't recognize me, do you?"
he said in a loud, clear voice. At this signal, which he had prearranged with his friends, 3 men, armed with metal poles, rushed into the room. Monsieur Leblanc grew pale, and gripped the back of the broken chair with his huge hands. Marius, meanwhile, raised his right hand with the gun, ready to fire the warning shot.
"The carriage is ready?"
Jondrette asked the 3 men.
"Yes, with 2 good horses,"
one of them replied.
"Excellent."
He turned to Monsieur Leblanc and repeated his earlier question. "You still don't recognize me, do you?"
"No."
"My name isn't Jondrette. It's Thénardier. Now do you recognize me?" Monsieur Leblanc trembled slightly, but still shook his head. Marius, however, who had been going to fire the gun as a signal for the police to arrive, shook so much that he almost fell off the cupboard. "Thénardier," he thought. "That's the name of the man who saved my father's life at the Battle of Waterloo. The man I've promised to help." If he fired the warning shot, Monsieur Leblanc would be saved, and Thénardier would be destroyed. But he would also have broken his promise to his father. He felt his knees grow weak. What should he do? Thénardier walked up and down in front of Monsieur Leblanc. "Do you remember the little inn in Montfermeil 8 years ago? You took away our Cosette, do you remember? Wearing that old yellow coat, pretending you were a tramp? Well, now you're going to learn that you can't make things right by just bringing a few hospital blankets. You're the cause of all my troubles. For 1,500 francs, you took away a girl who was bringing me lots of money." "I don't know what you're talking about," Monsieur Leblanc said. "I don't know who you are, but I know what you are. You're a dirty criminal." "A criminal?" Thénardier said, suddenly angry. "That's what you rich people call people like me, isn't it? Just because I've failed in business. I was a war hero, you know. I saved an officer's life at Waterloo, and you call me a criminal? Well, I'm gonna teach you a lesson." He began to move towards Monsieur Leblanc, but the old man was too quick for him. With surprising speed, he pushed the table and chair to one side and ran to the window. He managed to open it, but before he could jump, the three men jumped on him and held him to the floor. This was too much for Marius. "Forgive me, father," he murmured, preparing to fire the gun. But suddenly Thénardier cried, "Don't hurt him!" After a long fight, Monsieur Leblanc was tied up and taken to the bed. "No wallet?" Thénardier cried, having searched his pockets. "Never mind." He sat on the bed next to the helpless but brave old man and said, "Let's discuss things quietly. All I'm asking for is 200,000 francs. I realize that you don't have the money with you now, but I want you to write a letter. I'll tell you what to say." He untied Monsieur Leblanc's right hand, and producing a pen and paper began, "My dearest daughter, you must come at once. I need you urgently. The person who gives you this note will bring you to me. I shall be waiting." Monsieur Leblanc signed his name Urbain Fabre, which seemed to satisfy Thénardier, and wrote an address on the envelope. Thénardier then took the letter and gave it to his wife. "There's a carriage outside. Don't be long." Nearly half an hour passed. Thénardier seemed lost in his own dark thoughts. The prisoner did not move. Finally, there was the sound of horses in the street outside, and moments later the door to the room was thrown open. "It's a false address!" Madame Thénardier cried. "There's no Urbain Fabre. The old man's been lying to us." Thénardier sat on the corner of the table in silence for some moments, swinging his leg and gazing with a fierce satisfaction at the fire. Then he turned to the prisoner and said in a slow, threatening voice, "What did you hope to gain by giving me a false name and address?" "Time!" cried the prisoner in a loud voice, jumping from the bed, having secretly cut the ropes that tied him. Before the others in the room could react, Monsieur Leblanc was standing by the fire, holding a metal bar above his head. "I am not afraid of you," he said, "but neither should you fear me." With those words he threw the metal bar out of the window into the street below. "Get him!" Thénardier shouted. "He's defenseless!" Two men grabbed him by the shoulders. "Now cut his throat!" Thénardier called. Marius stared, frozen with fear, as Thénardier, knife in hand, stood hesitating a few steps away from the prisoner. The brave man was in terrible danger, but Marius still could not fire the gun. Then, in the moonlight, he saw the solution to his problem. On top of the cupboard by his feet, he noticed the piece of paper that the elder daughter had written on. "Be careful, the police are coming." He immediately saw what he had to do. He took a piece of brick from the wall. wrapped the piece of paper around it, and threw it through the hole into the middle of Thénardier's room. He was just in time. Thénardier was advancing towards his prisoner, knife in hand, when his wife cried, "Something fell!" She picked up the piece of paper and handed it to her husband, who read it quickly. "It's Éponine's handwriting," he cried a moment later. "Quick! Get the ladder! The police are coming and we've got to go!" They threw the rope ladder from the open window, but before they could escape, the door opened and Inspector Javert walked in. "Relax," he smiled. "You can't escape through the window. There are 5 of you and 15 of us. You have no chance. Why not come quietly?" The men put down their weapons and surrendered without a fight. When everybody had been arrested and taken from the room, Javert noticed the prisoner, who was standing, head bowed, by the window. He turned to speak to another policeman, but when he looked back, he saw that the prisoner had gone. Javert rushed to the open window and looked down. The rope ladder was swinging gently above the empty street. "He must have been the cleverest of them all," Javert murmured angrily to himself. Chapter 8. Marius and Cosette. Not wishing to give evidence against Thénardier in court, Marius made immediate arrangements to leave his room. Early the following morning, he paid the concierge his final rent and went to live with his friend Enjolras. Inspector Javert looked for Marius everywhere, but without success. 2 months later, Marius was deeply unhappy. He sent money every Monday to Thénardier, who was in prison, which meant that he had even less money for himself. But the main reason for his unhappiness was that he was forced to live his life with no hope of seeing Ursula. One afternoon he was sitting in a field looking down at a small river, when his dreams of Ursula were suddenly broken by the sound of a familiar voice. He looked up and recognized Éponine, Thénardier's elder daughter. Still wearing the same rags, with the same bold look in her eyes and the same rough voice, she had somehow become more beautiful. She stared at Marius with a look of pleasure on her pale face, and for some moments seemed unable to speak. "So, at last I've found you," she finally said. "I've been looking for you everywhere. You aren't living in the same room anymore?" "No," said Marius. "Well, I can understand that. It's not nice, that sort of thing. But why are you wearing that dirty old hat?" When Marius gave no answer, she went on, "And you've got a hole in your shirt. I'll mend it for you. A young man like you ought to be nicely dressed." Marius still said nothing, and after a moment's pause she said, "You don't seem very glad to see me. But I could make you look happy if I wanted to." "How?" said Marius. "What do you mean?" "You weren't so unfriendly last time." "I'm sorry. But what do you mean?" She bit her lip and hesitated, as if trying to make up her mind about something. Finally she said, "I've got the address." Marius's heart seemed to miss a beat. "You mean the address you wanted me to find out? The young lady, you know." Her voice sank into a sigh. Marius jumped up and took her by the hand. "Let's go at once!" he cried, wild with excitement. Then he suddenly frowned, and seized Éponine by the arm. "But you must promise me,"
he said, "that you'll never tell your father the address."
"I promise,"
the girl replied, staring at Marius with amusement. They had only gone a few steps when Éponine stopped and said,
"You remember you promised me something?"
Marius felt in his pocket. All he had in the world was the 5-franc piece he intended to give her father in prison. He pushed it into her hand, but she opened her fingers and let the coin fall to the ground. She looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and sadness in her eyes.
"I don't want your money," she said.
That evening, Cosette was alone in the house which Jean Valjean had bought about a year earlier. It was a small house in a back street, with a large wild garden. Valjean had gone away on business for a couple of days, and Cosette was in the downstairs sitting room, playing the piano. Suddenly she thought she heard the sound of footsteps in the garden. She listened at the window for a minute, then ran up to her bedroom, opened the window, and looked out. The moonlit garden and the street beyond it were completely empty. Cosette, not a nervous girl by nature, smiled to herself and thought no more about it. The next evening, as she was walking in the garden, she was sure that she heard someone moving in the trees. Again, when she looked round, she saw nothing. When Jean Valjean returned from his business the following day, Cosette told him about the noises in the garden. He told her not to worry, but she noticed an anxious look in his eyes. He spent the next 2 nights walking around the garden, checking the gate, listening for noises. But nothing unusual happened. Then, one morning a few days later, Cosette noticed a large stone lying on the garden bench. Nervously, she picked it up and discovered an envelope underneath it. Inside, there was a small notebook filled with love poems. Cosette sat down and began to read, enjoying the music of the language and the beauty of the handwriting. She had never read anything like this before, and it affected her deeply. Her heart on fire, she took the notebook upstairs to her bedroom and read every word again. She remembered the handsome young man she had seen so often in the Luxembourg Gardens. As she read the notebook, she knew in her heart that he was the author of these beautiful romantic words. Finally, she kissed the book, held it to her heart, and waited for the evening, when she knew that something special was going to occur. That evening, Jean Valjean went out. Cosette spent a long time in front of the mirror, making her hair look beautiful and deciding which dress to wear. Finally, she went out into the garden. She sat on the bench where she had found the notebook, and moments later had the strange feeling that she was being watched. She looked round and jumped to her feet. It was he. He looked paler and thinner than she remembered. His dark clothes were almost invisible in the shadows, and his face shone softly in the fading light. Cosette felt suddenly faint, but she did not move or make a sound. "Forgive me for being here," Marius spoke at last, "but I've been so unhappy. Do you recognize me? You mustn't be afraid. It's a long time ago. But do you remember the day when you first looked at me? In the Luxembourg Gardens? And the day you walked past me? Those things happened nearly a year ago. Forgive me for talking like this. I don't know what I'm saying. Perhaps I'm annoying you. But the truth is, I can't live without you." "Mother," Cosette murmured, and began to fall. Marius caught her and held her tightly in his arms without realizing what he was doing, lost in a mist of love. Cosette, feeling her body close to his, took his hand and pressed it against her heart. Aware of the shape of the notebook under her dress, he said, "So you've read my notebook. Do you love me too?" "Of course," she answered in a low voice. "You know I do." Then, as if by magic, her lips were next to his, and they were kissing. Afterwards, they sat together on the garden bench in a state of shock, neither of them speaking. Beneath the stars they were happy just to look into each other's eyes and hold each other's hands. Then, at last, they began to speak. They talked all evening about their dreams, their mistakes, their moments of happiness, their moments of despair. When everything had been said, she laid her head on his shoulder and asked, "What's your name?" "My name's Marius." "And yours?" "Cosette." During that month of May, in the year 1832, Cosette and Marius met every day in the wild garden of that small, secret house. They would sit and hold hands and talk, or just gaze into each other's eyes and smile. "How lovely you are," Marius would sigh. "There are moments when I think this is a dream. There are other moments when I think I'm a little mad. I love you so much." To which Cosette would reply, "I love you more with every minute that passes." In this way, bathed in happiness, they lived untroubled by the world. One beautiful starry evening, Marius found Cosette sitting unhappily in her garden. "What's the matter?" he asked, sitting next to her on the bench. "My father said that we may have to leave," she replied. Marius trembled. For 6 weeks he had known nothing but uncomplicated happiness. Now, for the first time, there was a cloud in the clear blue sky of his life. He could not speak, and Cosette felt his hand grow cold. She asked, as he had done, "What's the matter?" He replied in a voice so low that she could hardly hear it, "I don't understand what you mean." "Father told me this morning that I have to pack everything and be ready to leave for England within a week." Marius rose to his feet and said coldly, "Cosette, are you going?" She looked up at him, her pale face lined with misery. "What else can I do?" she cried. "So you're leaving me?" "Oh, Marius, why are you being so cruel to me?" Marius turned his back to her and said, "Then I shall have to go away." "No, Marius, wait. I've got an idea." Marius turned and was surprised to see her smiling. "What is it?" "If we go, you must come too. I'll tell you where, and you must meet me there, wherever it is." "How can I possibly do that?" he cried. "Are you crazy? You need money to go to England, and I haven't got any. I haven't told you, Cosette, but I'm a poor man. I wear a cheap hat. My jacket has lost half its buttons, and there are holes in my boots."
He turned away from her and stood with his face pressed to the trunk of a tree, almost ready to faint. He stayed in that position for some time. Finally, he heard a small sound behind him, and turning round, he saw that Cosette was in tears. He fell on his knees in front of her and pressed her hand to his lips. "Don't cry," he said. "I cannot let you leave me. I promise you that if you leave me, I shall die. But listen to me. I have a plan. Don't expect me here tomorrow." "Why not?" Cosette said, drying her tears. "A whole day without seeing you, that's unbearable." "It's worth losing a day together if we want to be happy for the rest of our lives." "But what are you going to do?" "Wait until the day after tomorrow. I'll tell you then. But until then, I must give you my address. I'm living with a friend of mine, Enjolras." Marius then took a knife out of his pocket and scratched his address on the wall. 16 Rue de la Verrerie. "Please, Marius," Cosette said as she watched him. "Where are you going tomorrow evening? I won't be able to sleep if you don't tell me." "I'm going to try something." "Well, I'll pray for you to succeed, and I'll never stop thinking about you. I'll ask no more questions, but you must promise to be here early the day after tomorrow, not later than 9 o'clock. "I promise," Marius said. Chapter 9. Monsieur Gillenormand. Monsieur Gillenormand, Marius's grandfather, was now 90 years old. He was unhappy about many things. About losing his teeth, about the political situation, but, most of all, about the fact that he had not seen his grandson for 4 years, since their big quarrel. Although he was too proud to admit he was wrong, and although he was angry, Monsieur Gillenormand hoped that Marius, whom he still loved, would return one day. One evening in June, Monsieur Gillenormand was sitting in front of a large fire, staring into the flames and thinking bitterly of Marius. He was feeling depressed, because he realized that he would probably never see his grandson again. While he was gazing into the fire, thinking these sad thoughts, his old servant entered the room, and asked, "Will Monsieur receive Monsieur Marius?" For a moment, all the blood seemed to leave Monsieur Gillenormand's face, and the servant began to worry that his master was ill. But the old man finally raised his head and said, in a low voice, "Show him in." Marius stood uncertainly in the doorway. The poor condition of his clothes could not be seen in the half-darkness of the room. Nothing of him was clearly visible except his face, which was calm and serious, but strangely sad. Monsieur Gillenormand stared at his grandson with disbelief. At last, after 4 years, was it really him? He wanted to open his arms and hug him, but all he said was, "What have you come for?" Marius murmured something in embarrassment. "I can't hear you," the old man said, looking annoyed. "Have you come to apologize? Do you now see that you were wrong?" "No, monsieur." Marius lowered his eyes. "Well then," the old man shouted, "what do you want?" "Monsieur, I ask you to have pity on me. I know I'm not welcome here, but I have come to ask for only one thing. Then I'll go away at once." "You're a young fool," the old man said. Who said you had to go away? You left me, your grandfather, to join in those street protests against the government, I suppose. You're probably in trouble with the police, or you're in debt, and you've run back to me for help.
Monsieur, it's none of those things.
Well, what is it exactly that you want?
I have come to ask your permission to get married. The old man paused for a moment before saying,
So, you want to get married at the age of 21? I suppose you've got some sort of career now. Perhaps you've made a fortune. What do you earn as a lawyer?
Nothing.
Well then, I imagine the lucky girl must have money.
She's no richer than I am.
What does her father do?
I don't know. Monsieur Gillenormand turned away with disgust.
So that's it. 21 years old? No job, no money? Your wife will have to count the sous when she goes to the market, won't she?
I beg you, monsieur, Marius cried. I love her so much. Please allow me to marry her. The old man gave a high, unpleasant laugh.
So, you said to yourself, I'll have to go and see him, that old fool. He'll be so happy to see me that he won't care who I marry. I haven't a pair of shoes, and she hasn't a shirt, but never mind. I'm going to throw away my youth, my career, my whole life, and dive into poverty, with a woman around my neck. That's what you think, isn't it? Well, my boy, you can do whatever you want, but I will never give you my permission. Never! Grandfather, never!
The tone of his grandfather's voice robbed Marius of all hope. He rose and crossed the room slowly with his head bowed. He had just reached the door, however, when Monsieur Gillenormand moved quickly towards him, pulled him back into the room, and pushed him into an armchair.
"Tell me about it,"
he said to Marius, who stared back with silent amazement, unaware that the word grandfather was responsible for the change in the old man's behaviour.
"Come on, tell me about your love affairs. Don't be afraid to talk. Don't forget I'm your grandfather. Here," he said, taking a purse from a drawer and putting it on the table. "Here's some money for you. Buy yourself some new clothes."
Marius told his grandfather all about Cosette, and how much he loved her. Monsieur Gillenormand listened carefully, and when Marius had finished, he laughed.
You must enjoy yourself when you're young," he said. "But you must also be sensible. Don't get married yet. That's my advice. Have fun with the girl, but don't marry her. Make her your lover, but not your wife."
Marius, too shocked to reply, shook his head and rose to his feet. He then turned slowly to the old man, bowed deeply, and said, "4 years ago, you insulted my father. Today, you have insulted my future wife. I shall ask no more favours of you, monsieur. Goodbye." Monsieur Gillenormand called for Marius to come back, but it was too late. The proud young man had closed the door and gone.
"Oh, my God!"
the old man cried, burying his face in his hands. What have I done? This time he'll never come back." Marius left his grandfather's house in a state of despair, and returning to his room, fell asleep, fully dressed on the bed. When he woke up, Enjolras was in the room with a few other friends. They all looked very nervous and excited about something. "What's the matter?" Marius asked sleepily. "Are you coming to the funeral of General Lamarque?" "Who's he?" Enjolras and his friends shook their heads with amazement at their friend's lack of awareness, and soon left the room. Marius opened a drawer and took out the 2 guns which Inspector Javert had lent him in February. Putting them in his jacket pocket, he went out and continued to wander aimlessly around the streets, noticing only occasionally the strange atmosphere of excitement that was growing in the town. People were running around, and there was a lot of noise, but Marius paid little attention. He could think of only one thing: his meeting later that evening with Cosette. This would be his last brief happiness. After that, there would be only darkness. At 9 o'clock that evening, Marius crept into the garden of Cosette's house. But she was not there waiting for him as she had promised. Looking up, he saw that there were no lights on in the house, and that all the windows were closed. Unable to control himself, he beat his fists against the walls of the house. "Cosette!" he cried, not caring who heard him. "Where are you?" He called her name again and again, until, exhausted, he sat down on the stone steps. Now she was gone, he told himself. He had no future. There was nothing for him to do except die. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling through the trees from the street. "Monsieur Marius!" He looked up. "Who's that?" "Is that you, Monsieur Marius?" "Yes." "Your friends are waiting for you at the barricade, in the Rue de Chanvrerie." Marius ran to the gate, and was just in time to see the figure of Éponine, Thénardier's daughter, disappearing into the shadows at the end of the street. Chapter 10. The Barricade. In the spring of 1832, the people of Paris were ready for revolution. Charles X, who had become king in 1824, believed that he had total power over the French people. He was a strong supporter of the Catholic Church and the aristocracy, and he took away the freedoms that Napoleon had given the ordinary citizens. Although this made him very unpopular, he thought that his opponents would be too weak to prevent him from doing what he wanted. He was wrong. In 1830, there was a peaceful revolution, and he was forced to leave. The new king, Louis-Philippe, was a brave and clever man who loved his country. The ordinary people liked him at first, but he soon showed that he was more interested in power for his family than democracy for his people. He understood business, but he could not understand the problems of poor people. Neither could he understand the concept of freedom of speech, and he often sent soldiers into the streets to attack people who were making public protests. As the summer approached, the mood of the workers and the poor became angrier and angrier. Their anger exploded into violence in June 1832, when General Lamarque died. The general had been very popular with the people of France because of his love for Napoleon.
The day of his funeral was arranged for the 5th of June, and thousands of people saw this as a chance to make a public protest against the king and his government. At first, the funeral went quietly. Soldiers accompanied the coffin as it was carried slowly across Paris. A large crowd followed behind, waving flags and carrying swords and heavy sticks. The crowd grew more and more excited, until finally they tried to take the coffin away from the soldiers and carry it across a bridge. Their exit was blocked by more soldiers on horseback. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there were 2 gunshots. The first shot killed the commander of the soldiers guarding the exit to the bridge. The second killed a deaf old woman who was trying to shut her window. Then the fighting started. Soldiers attacked the crowd with swords. The crowd threw stones and ran screaming across the bridge. Minutes later, the sounds of war echoed across the whole city of Paris. As soon as the fighting started, Enjolras and several of his friends started to build a barricade outside the Corinth wine shop, in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, a small street surrounded by dark alleys in the market district of Paris. Enjolras had been joined by many strangers as he and his friends had run shouting along the street. There was a tall, grey-haired man whom nobody knew, but whose strong, brave face had impressed everybody. There were several street children, excited by the sound of battle, who also joined them. One of these children was Éponine, who had dressed like a boy so that no one would tell her to go home. Having run to tell Marius that his friends were waiting for him, she was helping Enjolras and his companions to build the barricade. New people arrived all the time, bringing with them gunpowder and weapons to fight the soldiers who would be arriving very soon. Enjolras, who was the leader of the rebels, organized the building of a second barricade and the manufacture of bullets from melted silver. The tall, grey-haired man was doing useful work on the larger barricade, and Éponine, whom everyone thought was a boy, worked hard too. The barricades were finished in less than an hour, and with the sound of drums in the city growing louder, Enjolras brought a table out into the street and sat down with his friends for a drink. Night fell, but nothing happened. While the 50 men behind the barricade waited impatiently for the arrival of 60,000 soldiers, Enjolras approached the tall, grey-haired man. "Who are you?" he asked. When the man said nothing, Enjolras became suspicious. "You're a policeman, aren't you?" he said. The man smiled, and eventually admitted that he was. "My name's Javert," he said. Before he could move, Enjolras ordered 4 men to search him. When they found a letter in his pocket which proved that he had been sent to spy on them, they tied him to a post inside the inn. "You'll be shot 2 minutes before the barricade falls," Enjolras informed him. Marius left the garden, and, mad with grief at losing Cosette, walked towards the sound of drums and gunfire in the centre of the city. He had only one thought in his mind. He wanted to die. Marius pushed his way through the crowds of frightened, murmuring people that filled the streets until he reached the market area. Here he found the unlit streets suddenly filled with soldiers. Unafraid, Marius ran through the shadows, ignoring shouts for him to stop. Someone fired a gun, and a bullet hit a wall just behind him, but he didn't care. He was just approaching the Rue de Chanvrerie when he heard a loud voice calling from the shadows. "Who's there?" "The French Revolution!" he heard a distant voice reply. The voice of his friend Enjolras. Marius stood behind an alley wall, hidden in the shadows. Around the corner, he could see a row of soldiers aiming their guns down the Rue de Chanvrerie, waiting for the order to fire. "Fire!" The order finally came. The street was lit with a sudden flash of light and filled with the thunder of gunfire. Then the soldiers attacked. Marius stood up and ran along a series of alleys that led into the Rue de la Chanvrerie, behind the Corinth wine shop. When he reached the stronghold, soldiers were already climbing the barricade, shooting at the rebels. Marius saw a soldier attacking Enjolras, who had fallen backwards and was calling for help. Marius took Javert's guns from his pockets and shot the soldier dead. Soldiers now occupied the top of the barricade, but were unable to advance any further because the defenders fought so fiercely. Marius, who had thrown away his guns and was now without a weapon, began to move towards a barrel of gunpowder he had seen near the door of the wine shop. He did not notice a soldier aiming his gun at him. Neither did he see, at the moment the soldier fired, a young boy, dressed in rags, jump in front of the gun, and fall wounded as the bullet meant for Marius hit him in the hand. "Put down your weapons and surrender!" a soldier called from the top of the barricade. "Fire!" Enjolras shouted. The soldiers and the rebels fired at each other at the same time, filling the air with thick clouds of dark smoke. When the smoke cleared, there were many dead bodies on both sides. The survivors were reloading their guns in silence, when suddenly a loud voice called, "Get out now, or I'll blow up the barricade!" All heads turned to stare in the direction of the voice. Marius was standing at the foot of the barricade, holding a flaming torch above a barrel of gunpowder. "If you blow up the barricade," a sergeant called, "you'll blow up yourself as well." Marius smiled and lowered the torch towards the gunpowder. Within seconds, the soldiers had left the barricade, leaving their dead and wounded behind, and were running into the darkness at the far end of the street. Enjolras threw his arms around Marius's neck. "So you've come!" he cried. Marius hugged Enjolras and many other friends he recognized. While the soldiers waited at the far end of the street for further orders, and the rebels removed dead bodies from the barricade and took care of the wounded, Marius walked around the stronghold in a kind of dream. After 2 months of happiness with Cosette, he was now in the middle of a war. He could not believe this was happening to him. He was so confused that he did not recognize Javert, tied to a post inside the inn throughout the battle. As he was walking by the smaller barricade, his thoughts were interrupted by a weak voice calling his name from the shadows. "Monsieur Marius!" He looked about him, but seeing no one, he started to walk away, thinking that he was imagining things. "Monsieur Marius!" He heard the voice again. Marius gazed into the shadows, but could still see nothing. "I'm at your feet," the voice said. Looking down, Marius saw a dark shape crawling along the ground towards him. By the light of a lamp on the pavement, he could see a torn jacket, trousers with holes in them, and 2 bare feet. A white face was turned towards him, and the voice asked,
"Do you recognize me? It's Éponine."
Marius bent down quickly and saw that it was indeed that unhappy girl, dressed in a man's clothes. "What are you doing here?" he said. Then, noticing the pool of blood on the ground behind her, cried, "You're wounded! I'll carry you to the inn. They'll take care of you there. Is it very bad?" She showed him the bullet hole in her hand.
"A soldier was going to shoot you,"
she said, her voice no more than a whisper.
"But I put my hand in front of his gun."
"You poor child," Marius said. "We'll put a bandage on that wound immediately. You'll be all right."
"The bullet passed through my hand,"
Éponine murmured.
"But it came out through my back. It's no use trying to move me. But I'll tell you how you can treat my wound better than any doctor. Sit down on that stone, close beside me."
Marius sat next to her. She rested her head on his knee and said, without looking at him,
"Oh, what happiness! Now I don't feel any pain."
For a moment she was silent. She pressed her hand to her chest, from which blood was pouring like dark wine. Then, with a great effort, she raised herself on one arm and, struggling for breath, looked into Marius's eyes.
"I can't cheat you," she said at last. "I have a letter for you in my pocket. I've had it since yesterday. I was asked to post it, but I didn't. I didn't want you to get it. But now we're both going to die. It doesn't matter, does it? I can't be jealous any more. Take your letter."
She took hold of Marius's hand with her wounded hand, and without seeming to feel the pain, guided it to her pocket, from which he took the letter.
"Now you must promise me something for my trouble," she said. "You must kiss me on the forehead after I'm dead. I shall know."
She let her head fall back on his knees. Her eyelids trembled, and then she was still. Just as Marius thought that her sad soul had finally left her body, she slowly opened her eyes, and said, in a voice so sweet that it seemed already to come from another world,
"You know, Monsieur Marius, I think I was a little bit in love with you."
With those words, she closed her eyes for the last time and died. Marius kissed her pale forehead and laid her gently on the ground. Then he returned to the wine shop and opened the letter that she had given him. By candlelight he read, "My dearest, we are leaving this house at once. We go tonight to number 7, Rue de l'Homme Armé, and in a week we shall be in England. Cosette. The 4th of June." Marius covered Cosette's letter with kisses. So she still loved him. He thought for a moment that now he must not die. But then he thought, she's going away. She was going with her father to England, and his grandfather had refused to give his permission for him to marry. Nothing had changed, and he decided that he had one last duty to perform. He must send Cosette a final message, and tell her of his death. He tore a page out of the pocket notebook he always carried, and wrote, "Our marriage was impossible. I went to my grandfather, and he refused to give his permission. I have no money, and neither have you. I hurried to see you, but you had gone. You remember the promise I made you. I shall keep it. I shall die. I love you. When you read this, my soul will be very near and smiling at you." He folded the letter, wrote Cosette's new address on the back, and called over a young boy. "What's your name?" he asked the boy. "Gavroche." "Well, Gavroche, will you do something for me? I want you to deliver this letter to the address written on the outside." The boy scratched his head, thought for a moment, and then, with a sudden movement, took the letter and ran off into the night.